Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning into Facebook Live to hear the story of my parents' survival. I'm Florie Sagett and the child of two survivors of the Holocaust. I grew up in Skokie and I've been a volunteer at the Illinois Holocaust Museum for about 10 years. It has meant a great deal to me to be able to give back and be part of my family's legacy. Their stories and those of all the survivors must be told so that the atrocities of the Holocaust will never be forgotten. Growing up in our home, my younger sister Judy and I were able to understand from an early age the experiences of our parents during the Holocaust. They shared these with us openly and freely with great strength in an effort for us to understand our family's heritage. We were fortunate since many survivors were hesitant to share their experiences. Today, I would like to share the stories of how my parents, Manfred and Ursula Joachim, survived the Holocaust. Their stories are both quite different, but after emigrating to America, along with other family members, they each settled in Chicago and so began their new life together. Life for my father, Manfred Joachim, began in September of 1914 in Dresden, a small town outside of Berlin, Germany. He was the son of Jacob and Florie Joachim, who owned and operated a bakery. He was the third child of five children and enjoyed a very normal and happy childhood. Dad was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish home, which is the most observant sect of Judaism. As a young man looking for a way to earn a living, his mother suggested he learn a trade, and so he became an apprentice watchmaker under the direction of the local jeweler. In January of 1934, his apprenticeship was completed, as evidenced by the certificate of completion, and he began working as a watchmaker. This trade served him well for the rest of his life. However, after Hitler came to power in 1933, life for the Jews became increasingly more difficult, and the owner of the shop was forced to sell out. My dad managed to eke out an existence until 1937, when conditions became so intolerable that he made plans to leave Germany. On October 21st, 1938, just 19 days before Kristallnacht, his travel passport out of Germany was issued. Notice the J for Jew on my father's passport. In August of 1938, the law requiring the middle name of Israel or Sarah to be placed in all passports of Jews was passed and took effect in January 1939. My father's passport was issued during the transition period, before all were required to have the additional name. My dad and his brother had plans to sail for the U.S. in late December 1938. However, 45 days before his ship was to sail, he and his brother Siegbert were arrested by the Nazis on November 9, 1938, better known as the Night of the Broken Glass or Kristallnacht. From November 9th through the 10th, 1938, Nazis in Germany torched synagogues, vandalized Jewish homes, schools, and businesses, and killed close to 100 Jews. In the aftermath of Kristallnacht, some 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to Nazi concentration camps. After Kristallnacht, conditions for German Jews grew increasingly worse. My dad and his brother were sent immediately to Sachsenhausen concentration camp outside of Berlin. They were imprisoned there for about 5 weeks when the German government honored their immigration papers and affidavits. Through the persistent efforts of his uncle in the U.S. and the American State Department, my father and his brother were released from Sachsenhausen and given 24 hours to leave Germany. With heavy hearts, they returned home to pack one suitcase and left Germany immediately. In that suitcase, my father packed his father's solid gold pocket watch and chain, along with his sacred prayer book. They said goodbye to their parents and younger sister, knowing that in all likelihood they would never see each other again. My grandparents were too old to leave the country and were not eligible for the affidavits that enabled my father and uncle to leave. And even though his younger sister Sidonia also received a valid affidavit to leave, she decided to remain in Germany with her fiancé in hopes that both of them would be able to leave for England in the coming months. Sadly, that was not to happen, and my grandparents and aunt were arrested by the Nazis, sent to Auschwitz, where they were all murdered. Auschwitz was the largest of the Nazi death camps and fell under Hitler's final solution policy to isolate and exterminate Jews and other minorities in Germany, as well as in Nazi-controlled territories. In Auschwitz alone, over 1.1 million prisoners were killed, either in the gas chambers and crematorium, shot, hanged, or died of disease, famine, and exhaustion. During a recent visit to the museum portion of Auschwitz, I was able to see the names of so many of my father's family who were murdered and are now inscribed in an enormous book of remembrance. The blue square is surrounding my grandmother's name, Florie Joachim. Sadly, the youngest of my father's siblings, Harry, was disabled and living in a facility for persons with developmental and intellectual disabilities. From what my father told us, Harry was part of the euthanasia program, which was the systematic murder of institutionalized patients with disabilities in Germany. It aimed to eliminate those who were considered life unworthy of life. Through their first mass murder program in 1939, known as T4, the Nazis killed an estimated 250,000 adults and children. My father's older sister, Gertrude, was able to flee Germany for England with her husband and 2 children before Kristallnacht. They eventually came to the US and settled in Chicago as well. Such are the difficult choices that the Jews were forced to make without knowing what was really going to happen to their families or if they'd ever see them again. After my father arrived in Chicago in late December 1938, he and his brother found a tiny apartment and found work in their respective professions. Shortly after the US entered World War II in 1941, my father and his brother proudly joined the American Army. They were made American citizens, and after basic training, my father was sent to Czechoslovakia, Germany, and France to use his skills as a watchmaker to repair the delicate Army instruments. Despite escaping Germany and the Nazi reign of terror, he was extremely proud to be among the American soldiers who went back to Europe. During his time in the Army, an article was written about him in a weekly Army newsletter entitled "Army Life is Bed of Roses," says former Nazi prisoner. The article includes the following. When asked what part he'd like to play in the fight against the Axis, my dad answered, "I think I'd be just the man for guarding those Nazis when we put them in one of our prison camps." My father returned in good health after the end of World War II back to Chicago. He continued his work as a watchmaker and met and married my mother, a new refugee from Europe, in October of 1947. He continued working as a watchmaker in the Chicago area for the next 40 years until his death in March of 1990. I was born in 1949 and am proud to carry the name Florence Sidonia in memory of my grandmother, Florie Joachim, and my aunt, Sidonia Joachim. My mother, Ursula was born in 1922 in Tegel, a suburb of Berlin, Germany. She was the second child of Heinrich and Gertrude Tannenzup. Her brother Fred was 8 years older. They lived on Berliner Strasse, which was a beautiful street in Tegel. Their department store was directly across of the apartment, and it was called Kaufhaus Tegel. Kaufhaus Tegel was a general department store selling clothing, fabrics, shoes, household items, etc. My mother's childhood, before the age of 13, was wonderful and happy. She was surrounded by many friends and loved going to school. They were part of the Jewish community and observed all the rituals and holidays. Life in Berlin was good until about 1934, when the racial laws began to change for the Jews. This meant that anyone could accuse a Jewish man of a crime and he could be arrested. Because of this, my grandparents made the decision to send my mother's brother, Fred, who was then 20 years old, to Palestine, which is now the state of Israel. Our families were Zionists at heart. Zionism is a movement for the reestablishment and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodor Herzl and was later led by Chaim Weizmann. So in mid-1935, my uncle left Berlin for Palestine. My grandparents had hoped that my uncle would want to settle there and then they would all follow. That was not to be. He wasn't happy in Palestine, still an underdeveloped country, and life there was very difficult. So after 1 year, he made plans to once again return to his family. So during the time of the 1936 Summer Olympic Games held in Berlin, Hitler camouflaged his anti-Semitic agenda while hosting the Games in hopes of impressing the many foreign visitors who were in Germany for the Games. However, during that time, with the freedom of the Jews deteriorating, my grandfather decided they must prepare to leave Germany. Luckily, in early 1935, through various business connections, my grandfather established a relationship with an official at the Honduran consulate. He took a great deal of their savings and purchased legitimate Honduras passports for my mother, my uncle, my grandmother, and himself. Since Honduras had an agreement with Holland regarding safe travel, they decided they would leave Germany and move to Holland. This one decision ultimately saved all four of their lives. In the summer of 1936, the German government confiscated my grandfather's department store, paying him 1 Deutschmark. My grandfather and family abandoned their apartment, leaving Berlin without telling anyone of their plans. At the same time, my mother's brother Fred left Palestine and joined them in Holland. When they arrived in Amsterdam in July 1936, they were able to find an apartment, and my grandfather and uncle opened up a small business. My mother's life was not as easy. She found it difficult to go to school without any knowledge of the Dutch language. After a number of months, this situation, my grandparents allowed her to curtail her studies and become an apprentice dressmaker. She loved to sew, and this trade served her well her entire life. It was often said that my mother had hands of gold. The years 1936 through 1938 were safe and uneventful for the Tannenzup family. However, in 1939, when the war broke out, my family decided it was best if they left for the US. My grandfather's sister lived in Chicago, and so they started the process of immigrating to the US. They were able to secure the necessary affidavits and visas to immigrate the following year. They booked passage to sail on May 11, 1940, on the Cunard White Star, which was to leave the port of Rotterdam for New York. As luck would have it, or not, the Nazis invaded and bombed the port of Rotterdam the day before, May 10th. They tried to reach the port in hopes of still boarding the boat, but never made it to Rotterdam, since there was no transportation readily available from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. My grandfather sewed the boat tickets into the lining of his jacket for safekeeping. They turned around and returned to Amsterdam, where they were able to rent a few rooms because they had given up their apartment. Shortly thereafter, the Jewish laws were enforced. This meant that all Jews had to be in their homes by 8 p.m. They were not allowed in the libraries, public buildings, restaurants, shops, etc. This, of course, was when they were directed to also wear the yellow Star of David. This is the actual star that my mother wore, which I have now displayed in my home as a constant reminder of my family's history. They remained safe for about the next year until June 11, 1941, when the Nazis stormed through all of Amsterdam at the very same time and picked up any Jewish man who happened to be outside on the street. Those men were immediately sent to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, where they were murdered. This caused greater concern for my family, and they remained very close to home until September 1942, when the Nazis arrested my grandfather and sent him to Westerbork, a work camp in the northeastern part of Holland. My grandmother and mother remained in seclusion, but on June 20th, 1943, the Nazis came to arrest them and sent them to Westerbork as well. They were happy to be reunited with my grandfather, and my uncle, who still lived in Amsterdam, and was ultimately arrested 3 months later and also sent to Westerbork. The Dutch government originally set up Westerbork in 1939 to accommodate Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. But after the Germans conquered the Netherlands in July 1940, Westerbork functioned as a transit camp where Jewish inmates performed forced labor before shipment east to other death camps where they were murdered. Over the course of the war, more than 97,000 prisoners were deported from Westerbork to Auschwitz, Sobibor, and Theresienstadt. Only 876 were liberated. This is my mother's work card from Westerbork. During their time in Westerbork, it was my mother's 21st birthday in July of 1943. When my grandfather was arrested, he somehow managed to sneak a silver dollar in his jacket. He asked one of the other Jewish prisoners, who was a silversmith, to carve a pin with my mother's name out of the silver dollar as a birthday gift. Here it is. It is engraved with the date and the words, "From Papa," a treasure my mother always cherished. I still have that pin today. Every Tuesday and Friday, a train of 1,010 prisoners were sent to Auschwitz, Sobibor, or Theresienstadt. There were always 10 extra people just in case 10 prisoners died during transport. As a prisoner in Westerbork, your main goal was never to be on that list. Because of their special Honduras passports, my mother and her family were saved from being placed on those transport lists. In early 1944, those prisoners who had special passports, such as those from the USA, England, Latin America, etc., were taken by train to Vitel, France. There were approximately 80 prisoners, including my mother and her family, who traveled for several days in a small train car with very little food or water. The Germans hoped to exchange these citizens of enemy countries in German internment camps for German citizens interned abroad. They arrived in Vitel, France, which was a series of hotels surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by the Germans with guns pointed into the camps. It consisted of a variety of hotels and a large park, all surrounded by barbed wire and constantly patrolled by armed guards. The hotels where the prisoners lived and did their own cooking had heat and running water. Prisoners could send and receive mail, receive visitors, and supplement their meager rations with Red Cross packages, which also supplied items they could barter with local inhabitants. They did not perform forced labor and were permitted to organize classes and lectures. In June 1944, the Allied forces invaded France. When the Germans heard that the armed forces were closing in, they left Vitel and left the prisoners on their own. It was a glorious day in June of 1944 when the U.S. tanks arrived and the American soldiers greeted the prisoners with the words, "You are liberated." However, the war wasn't over yet, and my mother and her family were sent for the duration of the war to another small town in France, La Bouboule, where they waited for the war to end. These were also a group of hotels used to hold the refugees until the war ended. There were no guards surrounding the area, and they were able to receive a great deal of aid from the Red Cross. Here is a map of my mother's journey from Amsterdam to from Germany to Amsterdam to Westerbork to Vitel to La Bouboule, and then back to Amsterdam after the war ended. In April 1945, when the war was over, they all returned to Amsterdam, their point of interest. They once again applied for their papers to leave Holland for America. This process took until early 1947 when they sailed for America. The tickets that they had hoped to use in 1940 and were sewn into my grandfather's jacket, he miraculously was able to use them again, and there were no extra fees. My mother and her parents arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey in mid-March 1947 and went directly to Chicago, where my grandfather's sister lived. Upon arriving in the U.S., they changed their name from Tanenzuk to Tannen. They rented an apartment and began their new life in the United States. My parents met in April of 1947 through mutual friends who were also refugees from Germany. They had a very short courtship, and after just 1 month, my parents were engaged. They were married in Chicago in October of 1947 and shared a strong and wonderful life together for 42 years until my father's death in 1990. My parents moved to Skokie in 1956 to live in a community of many other Holocaust survivors. They were proud of their new home and all that they were able to enjoy as Americans. My mother's brother, Fred, remained in Holland until 1948 when he emigrated to Chicago with his wife, Margie, also a Dutch survivor of Westerbork. They owned and operated a drapery store on the south side of Chicago for the next 35 years before they retired to Florida. My aunt, before her recent death at the age of 101, was able to help me put this presentation together. My mother continued using her skills as a dressmaker for most of the rest of her life. She loved to sew, and we were all the beneficiaries of her incredible talents. My mother's love for Israel was a great part of her life, and she traveled to Israel numerous times with my father, and then alone volunteered with Hadassah in Israel for 2 months each year for another 10 years. She and my dad left a rich legacy of pride in their Jewish heritage and love for the land of Israel. I'm proud to say that they passed this love on to their children and grandchildren. Both my parents had to make choices. They thankfully had the courage and vision to leave their homeland and start over in a foreign land, America, as well as to learning a new language. So despite Hitler and his band of Nazi perpetrators, my parents survived. In addition to 2 daughters, my parents enjoyed 5 grandchildren. Thankfully, my mother lived to see 3 of her 7 great-grandchildren born before her death in 2010. She was also lucky enough to be at the opening of the Illinois Holocaust Museum in April of 2009, and so proud to be part of that event. My parents always considered themselves fortunate and truly blessed. Thank you for listening, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Florie. We do have a couple questions.
Okay.
The first one, you mentioned, your mother going back to Israel, and did your family ever make, trips to Europe? Have you gone and kind of retraced their footsteps?
Yes, my parents went back to Israel many times, but never to Europe. There was no desire for them ever to set foot on European soil. And my sister and I did retrace my mother's steps in Berlin shortly after her death back in 2011. And we saw everywhere that she had lived, where she went to school, the store, everything that we could find in Tegel, we went to. Yes, it was a very moving experience. But my mother would have never done that.
You have amazing artifacts and images. How did you get a hold of some of that? Because I know some, doesn't kind of get held, and a lot of people don't have that. So how did you have those?
Well, because my parents had saved so much of that miraculously. What my father brought from Europe was the only 2 things that he, could bring in his suitcase when he left. And my mother's family was able to save some of those things. They were buried in the backyard of a Dutch family, a Gentile Dutch family, who also had the last name that began with a T. And so they buried all of their silverware and flatware and a lot of these other items in that backyard, and were able to retrieve them after the war, which was quite miraculous too.
Yeah, that is amazing.
Yeah.
When did you first start hearing your parents' story?
When we were young enough to understand. I can remember 3rd grade. I think I did when you bring in artifacts or, show and tell, shall we call it? And at that point, I think I brought something in that my father had brought home from the war for show and tell. So 3rd grade for sure, I can remember.
Wow. Yeah. Kind of piggybacking off of that, how much, especially when you went to Germany or, Berlin, how much of the story did you kind of fill in through additional research and whatnot?
Well, to be honest, my mother had done an entire Shoah Foundation interview. So many of the facts that I spoke of today, I got through her interview. When we went to Germany, we were really able to see a lot of the places where they had lived, but most of those places had changed. Like my grandfather's store, which was a department store, is now a Turkish grocery store. So, and when we went on the street and into the different stores, and we mentioned that our grandparents had a store there, true to form, nobody remembered anything. They had no answers, and they, as far as they were concerned, they knew nothing. So, not uncommon.
No. What made you decide to start sharing their story?
Because it was very important to my parents for their legacy, and for the sake of my children and my grandchildren. This is a very important story to be told, one not to be forgotten as the generations go on. So I'm very proud that I was able to tell it, and I hope I'll be able to tell it many more times.
It's an honor to hear it. I have one more question, it looks like.
Okay.
What do you want people to take away from hearing your family's story? What's the kind of lesson for them?
Well, the courage that my parents had, both in, they both had different situations. You just heard different stories. But the courage to leave their homeland and to go forward, come to a new country, and start all over again, which is really very difficult and something none of us can really relate to unless we've been through it. And I'm very proud of the fact that they had that courage and came to this country and made a new life for themselves and for my sister and I and the rest of our family. So.
Thank you. That is all the questions we have right now, so I will let you close this out.
Okay, thank you again for tuning in. Join us next Wednesday, May 26th at 10 a.m. Central Time to hear Karen Gillette, the daughter of Holocaust survivors, share her father's story. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times.